There's something that happens when you close your eyes and think about the house you grew up in. Not the address, not the size of the rooms. Something else entirely. A smell, a sound. The particular weight of cold air on your face when you stepped onto the landing on a winter morning. The way the light came through a certain window at a certain hour. These things don't leave you. They settle somewhere deep, and they stay. But here's what nobody talks about. The homes we grew up in, those houses from the 1950s, 60s and into the 70s, they worked in a completely different way from anything being built today. Not just the wallpaper, not just the carpet colors. The actual logic of the house was different. The rooms had purposes, the objects had meaning, the routines were built around the building itself. And then quietly, steadily, almost without anyone noticing, it all began to disappear. This isn't a story about nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. This is about understanding what was actually lost and why it went. Because some of it went for good reasons. And some of it went for reasons that when you look closely, aren't quite as straightforward as they seemed at the time. We're going to go room by room, feature by feature, through the British home as it existed before the 1980s changed everything. The open fire, the larder, the best room nobody was allowed to sit in, the milkman's bottles on the front step, the telephone table in the hall. Each one of these things wasn't just an object. It was a way of organizing life, a set of values made physical. And by the time we're done, you might find yourself looking at your own home, your perfectly heated, perfectly convenient, perfectly private home, and wondering what exactly was traded away to get here. Pay attention to this next part. Because the first thing we need to talk about is the one that sat at the very center of everything, the one that the whole house was arranged around. The one whose disappearance changed not just how British homes were heated, but how British families actually spent their time together. We're talking about the coal fire. And what happened to it tells you almost everything you need to know about what came after. In 1963, around 70% of British homes were still heated by coal. Not gas, not electricity, coal. Actual coal carried in from outside, stored in a bunker or a shed, shoveled into a grate every single morning. That was the reality of the British home well into the living memory of millions. And the fire wasn't just a heating system. That's the part that gets lost when we talk about it today. The coal fire was the emotional center of the house. It was where you sat, where you dried your socks after school, where the dog parked himself for the entire evening, where your father read the paper and your mother did her knitting and the children played on the hearthrug. George Orwell wrote about exactly this scene. He described it as one of the most essentially British images he could think of. The family arranged around the fire, not side by side staring at a screen, facing each other, facing the warmth. There was a ritual to it that people who grew up with it never quite forget. The laying of the fire in the morning, newspaper twisted into knots, then kindling, then the coal placed just so. The moment you held a sheet of newspaper across the front of the grate to draw up the draught and make the flames catch, the sound of it roaring behind the paper, the smell of it, the particular orange light it threw across the room as the evening drew in. It wasn't easy. Nobody pretends it was easy. The coal had to be brought in, the ash had to be cleared, the chimney had to be swept every couple of years, and if you let it go too long you risked a chimney fire, which was not just dangerous but deeply embarrassing. The neighbors would see the smoke. Everyone would know you hadn't kept on top of it. There was a social dimension even to that. But here is what nobody tells you about the coal fire. It was inefficient in the most human possible way. It heated the people sitting near it, not the room. You could have a hot face and cold feet at the same time. Cold feet and a warm front. The rest of the house, those were simply cold. Genuinely cold. In 1970, the average indoor temperature in a British home in winter was 12.1 degrees Celsius. 12 degrees, inside. That was normal. And yet, people gathered. They had to. There was only one warm place, and everyone went to it. The fire didn't just heat the body, it organized the family. It made the living room the place where life actually happened. That was about to change. And the change came from somewhere most people never expected. It came from under the North Sea. In the mid-1960s, engineers drilling beneath the North Sea made discoveries that would reshape Britain in ways that went far beyond energy policy. Natural gas. Enormous reserves of it. Clean, efficient, piped directly into homes. No shoveling. No ash. No chimney fires. Just a dial on the wall and instant warmth. The British government didn't leave this to chance. Between 1967 and 1976, they carried out one of the largest transitions in British history, converting the entire country from town gas to natural gas. Fitters were trained. Appliances were replaced. Information campaigns ran in every region. And right alongside it, a new technology was quietly making central heating affordable for ordinary households for the first time. Small-bore pipework, pipes under 30 millimeters, meant that a full heating system could be installed without tearing a house apart. It was cheaper, it was neater, and it worked. By 1977, nearly half of all British homes had natural gas central heating. By 2003, that number had reached 92%. The transformation was almost total. And it happened within a single generation. Now here is the part that rarely gets mentioned. The part that changes how you see all of this. In 1970, only 31% of British homes had central heating of any kind. That means that when most of the people watching this were children or young adults, the majority of British homes were still cold everywhere except where the fire was. The bedroom was cold. The bathroom was cold. Getting dressed in the morning was an act of genuine willpower. When central heating arrived, it felt like a miracle. And in many ways it was. Warmth in every room, hot water on demand, no more ice on the inside of windows, no more huddling. It was genuinely, undeniably better in practical terms. But something else happened at exactly the same moment. Something that nobody planned and nobody announced. When every room became warm, there was no longer any reason to be in the same room. The bedroom became habitable. The kitchen became comfortable. The children could go upstairs and the parents could stay downstairs, and everyone could be perfectly warm in their own separate space. The fire had forced togetherness. Central heating quietly ended it. One researcher studying this transition spoke to people in Rotherham who had lived through it firsthand. Many of them described the coal fire as the epicenter of the home from the 1940s right through to the 1960s, and when the transition to gas heating finally came, it was not entirely welcomed. Some people felt, without quite being able to explain it, that something important had gone, not the inconvenience, something underneath the inconvenience, something that the convenience replaced but could not replicate. The television, of course, was ready and waiting to fill the gap. It couldn't provide warmth, but it could provide a reason to sit in the same room, just facing a different direction than before. While the fire was disappearing from the center of British homes, something else was quietly vanishing from just outside the front door. Something that, if you grew up before the 1980s, you almost certainly took completely for granted. The sound of glass bottles on a doorstep at 6 in the morning. The milkman. In the early 1970s, 99% of British households had milk delivered to their door. Not most households. Not the majority. 99%. It was so universal it barely registered as a service. It was simply part of how mornings worked. You left your empty bottles out the night before. You might leave a note if you needed an extra pint. And before you were even properly awake, it was there, cold, fresh, in a glass bottle with a foil top. By 1975, around 94% of that milk was still being delivered in recyclable glass bottles. The electric milk float, that slow, quiet, almost surreal vehicle, was a fixture of every British street. Children knew its sound. Adults set their mornings by it. But the milkman was never just delivering milk. That is the thing that gets lost in the pure economics of what happened next. The milkman knew your routine. He noticed when the bottles hadn't been taken in. He knew which households had a new baby, which ones had someone poorly, which ones had just come back from holiday. He was, in the most practical and unromantic sense of the word, part of the community infrastructure. Then came the supermarkets. Not all at once. Gradually. Through the 1970s and especially the 1980s, supermarkets expanded across Britain with a logic that was very simple. Sell milk cheaper than the milkman could buy it. Use milk as a loss leader, price it below cost to get people through the doors, then make the money back on everything else in the basket. By the late 1980s, it had become cheaper to buy milk at a supermarket than from your milkman. And by 2001, supermarkets were selling milk at prices lower than what the milkman paid wholesale. There was no way to compete with that. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a structural dismantling. Today, only 3% of British households receive doorstep milk delivery. 3%. From 99 to 3. Within the lifetime of many people watching this, that is not gradual change. That is an erasure. And what went with the milkman wasn't just the bottles. It was a daily, quiet, reliable point of human contact. Someone who knew your name. Someone who noticed if something was wrong. In the age of supermarkets and self-checkouts and online shopping delivered by strangers in unmarked vans, that particular thing, being known by someone whose job was simply to bring you something fresh every morning, does not exist anymore in any meaningful way. Pay close attention to what comes next. Because we're going inside the house now. And the rooms themselves are about to tell a story that most people have never properly heard. Before the refrigerator became a standard fixture in British homes, the kitchen worked completely differently. Not slightly differently, completely differently. The whole logic of food storage was organized around the physical properties of different rooms, different temperatures, different purposes, and the house was built to reflect that. There was the larder, a cool, north-facing room or alcove, usually with a stone or tiled floor, thick walls, and a small ventilated window. This was where meat was kept, uncooked poultry, game if your household ran to it. The cool air kept it. The stone floor kept it cooler still. It was in effect a natural refrigerator built into the architecture of the house. Every respectable household had one. Then there was the pantry, different from the larder. The pantry was for dry goods, flour, sugar, preserved items, tinned goods, the bread bin, shelves from floor to ceiling, everything in its place. A room designed entirely around the act of storing food properly. And then there was the scullery, the wet kitchen. This was where the washing up happened, where vegetables were prepared, where the laundry was done. It was separate from the main kitchen by design. The steam, the mess, the noise, all of it confined to a room that existed specifically to absorb it. The refrigerator made the larder obsolete almost overnight. If you could keep everything cold mechanically, you didn't need a cool north-facing room built into your house. The larder became a cupboard, then a wall unit, then nothing. The dishwasher made the scullery unnecessary. The supermarket made the deep pantry impractical. Why store for a week when you could drive and buy fresh? The rooms shrank, then they disappeared entirely. What had been 3 or 4 distinct spaces, each with its own purpose and its own character, collapsed into a single fitted kitchen with laminate worktops and eye-level cupboards and a fridge freezer standing in the corner doing everything at once. It was more efficient. There is no question about that. But something about those separate rooms spoke to a different relationship with food. You knew where things were kept. You knew why they were kept there. The house itself taught you about temperature, about preservation. That knowledge lived in the architecture. When the architecture changed, the knowledge went with it. And if you think that's the most quietly significant thing that vanished from British homes after the 1970s, wait until you hear about the room that was always there. If you grew up in Britain before the 1980s, there is a strong chance your home had a room like this. It sat at the front of the house. It had the best furniture, the best curtains, usually kept half closed to stop the fabric fading, a cabinet with good china behind glass, maybe some ornaments on the mantelpiece that you were not allowed to touch, photographs on the wall of people who looked out at you with a kind of quiet authority. And it was almost never used. This was the front room, the best room, the parlor. Call it what you will, the name varied by region and by decade. But every household understood what it was and what it was for. It was not for daily life, it was for occasions, the right kind of occasions. The hierarchy of visitors was precise, and everyone understood it without being told. Ordinary neighbors were received in the kitchen. A traveling salesman stood at the door, but the doctor making a house call, the vicar on his annual visit, these people were shown into the best room. The fire, if there was one, would be lit especially. The room would be aired. The good cups would come out. Children understood instinctively that this room operated by different rules. You did not run in it, you did not play in it, you sat up straight. The chairs were not for lounging. The whole room communicated something without saying a word, that some spaces are held in reserve, that not everything is for every day, that certain things are kept special by being kept apart. This concept sounds almost incomprehensible to anyone who grew up after it disappeared. An entire room, furnished, maintained, heated on special occasions only, existing primarily as a statement of values rather than a practical living space. It seems wasteful. It seems strange. But look at what it actually represented. It was a physical expression of the idea that life has gradations, that not every moment is the same, that some things, some visits, some conversations deserve a different quality of attention and space. Central heating ended it. Not immediately, not all at once, but once every room in the house was warm all the time, the geography of formality collapsed. There was no longer a reason to save one room and live in another. Open-plan living accelerated the process. Walls came down, rooms merged. The distinction between everyday and special dissolved into one large, warm, undifferentiated living space. The best room was declared wasteful, and in purely spatial terms perhaps it was. But what replaced it was a house where everything is equally available, equally casual, equally ordinary. If you're enjoying this and want to keep exploring the Britain that shaped us, please do subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below telling us what you remember most about the home you grew up in. We read every single one, and share it with someone you know, because we are not done yet. There's one more feature of the old British home that disappeared so quietly, so completely, that most people under 40 have no idea it ever existed. And it changed the way families communicated with each other. There was a table in the hallway. Not a decorative table, not a place to drop your keys. A proper little table, sometimes with a small shelf underneath, almost always with a chair beside it. And on top of that table sat the telephone. One telephone. For the whole house. If you want to understand how differently British homes were organized before the 1980s, start here. The telephone was not a private instrument. It was a shared household object, positioned in the part of the house where it could be reached from every room but where it belonged to no room in particular. It was public by design. Everyone in the house could hear your conversation, simply because there was nowhere else to go. This had consequences. When you made a phone call, you were aware of being heard. You kept it brief. You chose your words. You were not going to have a long, private conversation with your mother 6 feet away, and there was a cost to the call. A literal financial cost, measured in units. Long-distance calls were expensive. Calls after 6 in the evening were cheaper. Calls on a Sunday were cheaper still. Children were told to keep it short. There was an economy to conversation that the mobile phone has completely erased. When the cordless handset arrived in the 1980s and then the mobile in the 90s, the telephone table became redundant almost immediately. The phone moved into every room, then into every pocket, then it never left your hand at all. The call became private, the conversation became endless, the cost became invisible. The telephone table now appears in antique shops and on vintage market stalls. People buy them without entirely knowing what they were for. They become plant stands, lamp tables, decorative objects in a home where every surface is available for whatever you want to put on it. What was lost, again, was not the inconvenience of a shared telephone in a draughty hall. What was lost was the way that limitation created a different relationship with communication. You thought before you called. You considered what you actually needed to say. The hallway telephone imposed a kind of discipline that no one chose and no one particularly enjoyed, but that produced a quality of attention to words that the modern phone has quietly abolished. So here is where we are. Room by room, object by object. We have walked through a version of Britain that millions of people lived in, and that has now almost completely vanished. None of these things disappeared because people stopped valuing them. They disappeared because of convenience. Warmer, cheaper, easier. The people who made those choices were not wrong. A home heated to 18 degrees is better than one at 12. Milk from a supermarket is cheaper. A refrigerator is more reliable. The argument has never been about convenience. The argument is about what convenience costs. Harder to quantify. Think about what each of these things actually did, underneath the practical function. The coal fire gathered the family into one room by necessity. The milkman made sure that someone outside the family knew your name and noticed your routine. The larder and the scullery and the pantry gave the house a kind of internal knowledge, rooms that taught you, just by existing, how the world worked. The best room told you that not every moment is equal. The telephone in the hall reminded you that words have weight. When those things went, what replaced them was not nothing. It was warmth, and abundance, and privacy, and choice. These are genuine goods, but they carried, quietly inside them, a loosening of exactly the things that had held households together. The necessity of proximity, the rhythm of being known by someone, the architecture of occasion, the discipline of limitation. In 1970, the average British home was cold and inconvenient, and organized around a logic that had barely changed in 100 years. By 2000, it was warm and efficient, and organized entirely around the individual. That shift, from the household as a collective organism to the home as a collection of private spaces, happened in less than 30 years. And it happened so smoothly, so wrapped in the language of improvement, that almost no one noticed what the improvement was replacing. You cannot go back. Nobody is suggesting you should. But there is something worth doing, even now, that costs nothing and requires no renovation. You can notice what those old limitations were actually producing. You can choose sometimes to sit in the same room, to be findable, to make an occasion of an ordinary evening, to hold something in reserve.